The stage rolled into town the way most bad news arrived in that country, slow, dust-choked, announced by the creak of leather and the tired complaint of wheels that had carried too many men too far for too little reason. It stopped in front of a mercantile whose paint had long since surrendered to the sun, and from it stepped a man who had once known how to stand at attention, though now he merely stood, one sleeve of his coat pinned neat and empty against his side, the other hand gripping a canvas bag that held everything he owned in the world, which was to say almost nothing at all. He had been 3 years finding his way back from the war, and in that time he had learned the particular cruelty of a place like this, how the heat pressed down without mercy, how the dust settled into a man's collar and stayed there, how the silence of strangers could feel louder than any battlefield he had survived. He had come west because there was nothing left to keep him east, no wife, no father's farm, nothing but the rumor that towns built on mining money needed hands willing to work, and he had 2 good legs and 1 good arm and a stubbornness that had outlasted better men. He found the first forge by the ring of hammer on iron, a sound that had always steadied him, even now, even with the memory of how that sound used to travel through both his arms at once. The shop stood at the edge of the main street, its doors thrown open against the heat, and the smith inside was a broad man with forearms like corded rope, sweat cutting clean lines through the soot on his face. He waited until the hammer paused before he spoke, because he had learned that much courtesy, at least, the war had not taken from him. "I'm looking for work," he said. "I've done smithing before. I can learn your tools, whatever they are." The smith looked at him only a moment, but that moment carried its whole verdict, traveling down from his face to the empty sleeve and settling there, as men's eyes always did now, as if the absence itself were the only fact worth reading. "Can't use a man who can't swing a hammer true," the smith said, and turned back to his anvil before the words had fully left him, the ring of iron on iron resuming, as though the conversation had never happened at all. He stood there a moment longer than pride should have allowed, watching the smith's back, listening to the rhythm that had, for one breath, seemed to promise him a place in it. Then he picked up his bag and stepped back out into the white glare of the street, where the town went on about its business, indifferent, and somewhere beyond the rooftops, a stamp mill thudded its slow iron heartbeat into the hot Arizona air. He walked the length of the town twice more that afternoon, past the mercantile with its dusty window glass and the assay office where men in clean collars conducted the business of other men's labor, past the saloon whose doors stood open to release a breath of stale beer and tobacco smoke into the heat, and by each door he had received some version of the same verdict, delivered sometimes with a shake of the head and sometimes with nothing at all, only a look that traveled to his sleeve and stayed there, as though the rest of him had ceased to exist beyond that single absent fact. His stomach had begun to ache with a hollowness that was no longer hunger alone, but something nearer despair, and he found himself walking without purpose toward the edge of town, where the buildings thinned and gave way to scrub brush and the long shadow of a cottonwood tree, beneath which stood a forge he had not yet tried, its chimney sending up a thin gray thread of smoke into the white sky. He might have passed it by, weary as he was of rejection, but the sound that reached him was not the confident ring of a smith at ease with his work. It was labored, uneven, the sound of someone fighting an axle that would not yield, punctuated by a woman's voice muttering words not meant for company. He stood at the open doorway and watched her a moment before she noticed him, a woman perhaps his own age, with her sleeves rolled past her elbows and sweat darkening the collar of her shirt, wrestling a wagon axle against the anvil with a strength that seemed borrowed rather than natural, as though will alone were doing the work her arms could not finish. "You've been standing there long enough to have offered help," she said, without turning, "or long enough to have decided against it." "I was deciding which," he admitted, and something in his own honesty surprised him. She looked at him then, taking in the sleeve, the dust of the road still on him, the bag at his feet, and her eyes did not linger on the absence the way the others had. "Can you work a forge?" "I can learn yours," he said. "I won't pretend I haven't lost something, but I haven't lost everything." She considered this with the same plain attention she might have given a piece of iron before deciding whether it could be shaped or must be discarded. "I can't pay a man to learn," she said, "but I can give you a week, room, board, and a fair wage, if by week's end you're worth keeping. If not, you'll go with a full belly at least, which is more than this town offers most men." He thought of the ledger of refusals behind him, and of the thin thread of smoke still rising from her chimney, stubborn against a dying claim. "A week," he said. "I'll take it." She led him into the house that stood behind the shop, a low structure of adobe and rough-hewn timber that had settled into the earth the way old things do when no one has the strength left to fight against gravity, and she set 2 plates upon a table scarred by years of use, plates that held little more than beans and a heel of bread and a strip of salted pork fried thin to stretch it further. He ate without complaint, having learned in the war that a man who complained about food was a man who had forgotten what hunger truly meant, and she watched him eat the way she might have watched a horse she was considering buying, not unkindly, but without sentiment either. "You should know what you're stepping into," she said at last, setting down her fork, "before you decide a week is worth your trouble." He said nothing, only waited, and she seemed to take his silence as permission. "My husband built that forge with his own 2 hands, back when the claim still had silver worth digging for. He died 3 winters past, and I've kept the doors open since, though the town's forgotten how, mostly." She looked toward the window, where the dark had settled fully now, and the shape of the shop was only a deeper black against the black of the sky. "There's a man in town, owns the mercantile and half the mine besides, and he wants this land. Wants it bad enough that he's offered to buy me out twice already and been refused twice already." "Why refuse him?" Caleb asked, and she turned back to him with something sharp in her eyes, though her voice stayed level. "Because it isn't his to have, and because my husband didn't build a business so I could hand it to a man who never lifted a hammer in his life." She folded her hands upon the table, and he saw then the calluses there, the burn scars old and silvered, the hands of a woman who had done a smith's work herself when there was no one else to do it. "The bank holds the note on this place, and they'll want to see it's earning before the season turns. If it isn't, they'll sell to whoever offers first, and we both know who that will be." "How much time?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the shape of the answer. "The bank man comes at week's end, same as I'm giving you. If the shop shows nothing worth counting, there won't be a shop left to save, week or no week." She rose then, gathering the plates, and did not look at him as she spoke her last words on the matter. "So you see, it isn't only your worth being weighed here, it's mine as well." Caleb sat a long moment in the dim light, turning the truth of it over the way he might once have turned a spent cartridge, and understood that the week ahead would ask more of them both than either had yet said aloud. He woke before the light did, in the small room off the back of the shop that she had given him, with a blanket and a nod and no more ceremony than that, and he lay a moment listening to the silence of a town not yet stirring, the silence that would not come again once the stamp mills began their grinding up the canyon. He rose in the dark, and dressed with the particular slowness of a man who had learned that haste only made a fool of him, tucking his shirt with his one hand, working the buttons by feel, and then he went out into the yard where the forge stood cold and waiting, like something that had not yet decided whether to trust him either. He did not light it, not yet. He stood before it a long while instead, turning over in his mind the shape of the problem the way he had once turned over a map before a march, honestly, without the comfort of pretending the ground was other than it was. A hammer wanted a hand to guide it, and a hand to steady the work, and he had but the one, and no amount of will was going to grow him another. So the answer, if there was one, would not be found in strength. It would be found in the fitting of things. He found in the lean-to a length of old harness leather gone stiff with age, and a vice clamp rusted to its bench, and he set to working them apart with a patience that made no promises about the hour. He shaped the leather into a cuff that might ride his forearm, stitched rough loops into it with an awl and waxed thread, and rigged the vise so the tongs could be locked and held while his hand turned free to the hammer. The first attempt failed within the first blow, the tongs twisting loose and the iron clattering to the dirt, and he stood over the fallen piece with his jaw set, saying nothing to the empty yard, for there was no one there to hear complaint, and he had never much cared for making it to himself. The second attempt held longer, held through 3 strikes before the strap slipped its knot and the whole rig sagged sideways, and he caught it before it fell only by dropping the hammer and steadying the tongs with his knee, an ungainly rescue that would have drawn laughter from any man watching, though there was mercy in the empty yard yet. The third time he tightened the buckle 2 holes further and set his stance different, feet wider, weight low, and when he swung the hammer came down true, and the tongs held, and the iron rang out once, clean, into the cold morning air, and he stood there afterward with his chest working hard, staring at the small, plain, imperfect thing he had made ring true, as though it were the first sound the world had made in a long while that belonged entirely to him. The days that followed carried the same rhythm as that first cold, ringing morning, though the rhythm itself grew steadier with each repetition, the way a man's stride grows steadier on a road he has walked enough times to know its ruts before his foot finds them. He rose before the sky had decided what color it meant to be, and he worked the yard alone while the town still slept its dreamless miner's sleep, and in that private hour he began to solve the problem of the bellows, which had defeated him nearly as thoroughly as the hammer once had, for a bellows wanted 2 hands the way a hammer did, one to work the lever and one to hold the iron steady in the coals, and he had only the one and a stump that ached when the weather turned. He took apart an old harness bracket he found rusting behind the shed and fashioned from it a treadle, a simple lever run down to a board beneath his boot, so that the pumping of the bellows became a thing his leg could do while his hand stayed free for the tongs, and the first time he worked it, the fire leapt up so bright and sudden that he laughed once, short and disbelieving, a sound the yard had not heard from him before. He reshaped his swing as well, for he had understood by then that he would never again hold iron steady with one hand and strike it true with the other, in the manner other smiths managed without thinking, and so instead he built the motion out of his shoulder and the turn of his hip, letting the weight of his body carry the hammer rather than the strength of an arm alone. And he practiced this turning motion the way a soldier practices a drill, over and over in the gray light, until the strangeness of it wore away, and something like grace crept in behind the effort. The horseshoes he made in those first days were rough things, thick in places where they ought to have tapered, and he set them aside without ceremony, telling himself only that a man learns a trade by ruining a few pounds of iron first. It was on the 5th morning that he finished one and did not set it aside. He turned it in the tongs, studying the curve of it against the rising light, and found no fault worth naming, and when he looked up, she was standing in the doorway of the shop in her apron, with her arms folded loose across her chest, watching him with an expression that gave away nothing and everything at once. She did not speak, and she did not step forward to take the shoe from him and inspect it the way a buyer might. And it was precisely her stillness, the plain, unhurried way she simply stood there and let the morning settle around them both, that told him she had seen enough to know the shape of what was coming, long before either of them said it aloud. He carried the water buckets down to the well that same afternoon, the way he had every day that week, because a man who could not fetch his own water had no business calling himself fit for anything harder. And it was there, among the men gathered in the thin shade of the well-house with their pipes and their idle talk, that he found the doubt waiting for him, plain and unashamed. The hired boy was among them, no more than 15, and full of the careless cruelty of boys who have not yet learned what it costs a man to lose something, and he said it loud enough to carry, the way boys do when they want to be heard by their elders more than by the one they speak of. "They say you can't hardly hold a horseshoe straight, let alone shape one," the boy said, grinning sideways at the men beside him. "Say you'll ruin every order that comes through that door before the month's out." The other men laughed the low, complicit laugh of those who have already decided a thing and only want the pleasure of hearing it confirmed, and one of them, a freight hauler with forearms like knotted rope, allowed as how he'd heard it too, from a man who ought to know, a man who sold iron by the wagon load and stood to profit handsomely should the widow's forge go quiet for good. He did not answer them with words, though a dozen answers rose in him, sharp and bitter as the vinegar his mother used to can with. He only set down the buckets, unhurried, and drew the water he had come for. And when the rope creaked and the bucket came up dripping, he lifted it with the same steady economy he had learned to bring to every motion since the harness had become a part of him. No wasted effort, no trembling, only the plain sufficiency of a man doing a plain thing well. Then, because the forge was near enough that the men could follow if their curiosity outweighed their scorn, he walked back with the water and set to finishing the wagon fitting he had left half-shaped that morning, working the bellows with his foot in that steady rhythm he had built for himself, out of leather and rope and stubbornness, and he did not look up when he heard their boots in the yard, did not pause when he felt their eyes on his back, but bent to the iron and let the ring of the hammer answer for him, calm and unhurried, the sound of it carrying out into the yard, long after the men had gone quiet to listen, and long after the boy, red-faced now, had found somewhere else to look. That evening, when the last of the light had gone the color of a dying coal, and the yard had settled into the particular hush that came after the heat broke, she set the ledger books on the table between them, and did not ask if he wanted to learn them, only opened the cover and turned the lamp so its light fell square across the columns of faded ink, and he understood that this, too, was part of the week's bargain, though neither of them had named it so. She showed him the accounts in the plain voice she used for everything that mattered to her, the debts owed to the bank, and the debts owed by the ranchers who paid in installments and sometimes not at all, the cost of coal freighted in from the railhead, and the thin margin left after, and he bent over the pages with the same attention he gave the iron, asking questions that were not idle, learning the shape of her worry the way he had learned the shape of the bellows. She watched his one hand move down the columns, steady, and thought that a man who could keep such careful account of numbers was not a man who would let anything slip through carelessness, and she did not say this aloud, only pushed the coffee closer to his side of the table. In the mornings it was his turn to teach, though he never called it that, only showed her, without ceremony, the small rhythms that made the forge answer rightly, how to read the color of the iron before it was ready to strike, how the bellows wanted feeding in a particular measure or the fire would gutter and sulk, how a tool laid wrong on the bench would cost a man 3 steps he need not have taken, she learned quickly, being the kind of woman who had already learned harder things alone, and there grew between them a language made mostly of silence, of a nod when the iron was right, of a held breath before the hammer fell, of 2 cups of coffee going cold side by side on the anvil's edge, while they waited for something to be ready that could not be hurried. The house, too, began to soften around the plain fact of him, though neither remarked on it. There was a second plate set now without discussion, a chair angled a little differently to leave him room for his shoulder, a lamp trimmed each night before he came in from the last of the evening's work, so the kitchen would not be dark when he crossed it. Small things, ordinary things, the kind a house gathers around a person only when it has decided, without asking permission, that he belongs to its rhythm now. She noticed these changes the way she noticed weather, without needing to name them, and if she lay awake some nights turning over the sound of a hammer that had begun to feel less like an intrusion on her solitude and more like its answer, she kept that too, unspoken, folded away with the ledger books, waiting for whatever the coming days would ask of her. He came on a Thursday, when the sun had climbed high enough to bleach the color from the sky, and the street lay quiet with the particular stillness of midweek, most of the town's men down at the played-out shafts pretending there was still silver worth the sweating. He came in a buggy too fine for the road it traveled, its wheels throwing up dust that settled like a fine gray judgment on his polished boots, and he did not wait to be greeted before stepping through the open doorway of the forge, as though he owned the ground beneath it, which, in some fashion he clearly believed, he soon would. He looked first at her, and then, deliberately, at the sling and the stump beneath it, letting his gaze linger a moment longer than courtesy allowed, the way a man might inspect a horse he had already decided was lame. "I've come to make a fair offer," he said, and named a sum that would have cleared the bank's note twice over and left something besides, his voice pitched loud enough to carry to the boy sweeping the yard, to the coffee going cold on the anvil's edge, to anyone who cared to hear how generous he could be to a widow in trouble. "Enough to see you comfortable, and no more need to gamble the place on—" He paused, and the pause itself was its own small cruelty, "on hands that can't hold half what they used to." The hammer did not stop. That was the thing she would remember after, how the rhythm at the anvil never faltered, how he kept working the iron as though the offer had been made to the forge itself and found unworthy of an answer, and how that steadiness, more than any word he might have spoken, seemed to unsettle the visitor far more than argument would have. She wiped her hands on her apron, unhurried, and met his eyes without heat. "I thank you for the trouble of coming out," she said, "but I've a week yet before I owe anyone a decision, and I mean to spend it seeing what this shop can do before I decide what it's worth." "A week," he repeated, as though the word itself were foolish. "You'll want more sense before the week's out, Mrs. Hale. Everyone in town already knows how this ends." "Then it won't trouble you to wait and see for yourself," she answered, and turned back toward the fire, the matter, for her, already settled. He stood a moment longer in the doorway, taking in the orderly rows of half-finished shoes, the neat stack of fittings cooling on the bench, the sight of a one-armed man bent steady and unbothered over his work, and something in his face tightened before he turned without another word and climbed back into his buggy, driving off in a fresh cloud of dust that hung in the windless air long after the sound of his wheels had faded, as though even the road were reluctant to let the visit go. The news came the way most news came to that town, riding sideways through the mouths of men who had heard it from other men, so that by the time it reached the forge it had already gathered the weight of certainty, though no one could say who had first spoken it plain. It was the boy from the mercantile who brought it, breathless from running, standing in the doorway with the particular relish of a child delivering something he did not fully understand, but sensed was important. He said that the merchant had put out word through the mine office and the saloon both, that he meant to place an order with the shop, an honest order, wagon fittings and shoes enough for the whole freight line coming through on the Tuesday run, and that he wanted it done by noon the following day, and that if the shop could not manage it, he would take that as answer enough for the town and for the bank besides. She listened without her hands ever stopping their work, the hammer falling in its patient rhythm against the glowing iron, and when the boy finished, she only nodded once, as though he had told her the weather had turned, and said that she supposed the man had never learned there was a difference between an order and a trap. But when the boy had gone, running back the way he came to spread the word further, she set down the hammer and stood a long moment with her palms flat against the anvil's cool edge, and Caleb saw in the set of her shoulders that she understood exactly what was being asked of them, and exactly what it would cost if they failed. He came to stand beside her, the harness creaking faintly at his shoulder where the leather had begun to soften with use, and he asked her plainly how many pieces the order would run, and she told him a number that made the evening air feel suddenly thinner, more shoes and fittings than the shop had turned out in a fortnight, all of it wanted by an hour that left barely a night's breath to work in. She said it as fact, without complaint, the way she said most things, but he heard beneath it the old fear returning, the one that had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with a debt that did not care how skilled a man's remaining hand had become. He looked at the forge, banked low for the evening, and at the tools laid out in their careful rows, and he said that they had better start now, before the fire went cold and the night grew any shorter than it already was. So they built the fire back up together, and the shop that had known so many solitary hours of one working while the other slept took on, in that hour, the character of a single instrument played by two sets of hands, though only 3 remained between them, and it seemed to him a fine number for the work at hand, better than he had ever thought to hope for. She stoked the coals and worked the treadle bellows he had built with his own measurements taken against his own body, and the leather sang under her foot in the rhythm they had practiced, without ever naming it practice, while he set the harness at his shoulder and took up the tongs and felt the iron answer him the way it had begun answering him these past weeks, not with resistance but with a kind of patient cooperation, as though the metal itself had grown accustomed to the particular authority of his grip. They fell into a trading of tasks that required no words at all, for words would only have slowed what their hands already knew, she drawing the stock from the fire at the precise moment his hammer wanted it, and no moment sooner, he shaping the shoe through its rough turns, while she readied the next billet, and when a piece called for the swage block or the hardy hole, she was there before he had to ask, setting the tool true against the anvil face so that his one hand could bring the hammer down clean and unhurried. The hours passed, marked only by the changing color of the iron, cherry to straw to the pale near white that meant urgency, and by the small sounds that had become, over the weeks, a kind of private language between them, the scrape of tongs, the creak of harness leather, the soft grunt of exertion that asked for water or for rest and was answered before it finished being asked. Somewhere near midnight she brought him bread and cold meat without his requesting it, and he ate standing at the anvil because sitting felt like surrender to an hour that would not wait, and she ate beside him in the same manner, and neither of them spoke of tiredness, though it sat plain in the hollows beneath her eyes and in the slower draw of his breath. The pile of finished shoes grew by the wall, each one checked by her hand before it joined the stack, and he watched her fingers move over the curve of iron he had shaped, and thought that no inspection from any rival's man could matter more than the quiet nod she gave each piece, for it was her judgment the shop had always trusted, and now, it seemed, his work had earned a place inside that trust, piece by piece, through the long dark hours that still stretched ahead of them. The gray light came slowly, as it always did over that country, seeping first into the eastern rim of the hills before it dared touch the valley floor, and by the time it reached the forge yard, the two of them had already stacked the last of the fittings into their crates, the final horseshoe cooling on the anvil where it had been set not 10 minutes before, with hands that trembled now not from doubt, but from the particular exhaustion of work finished rather than abandoned. He straightened first, feeling the ache travel from his shoulder down through the harness straps that had held him upright through hours he could not clearly account for, and she stood beside him wiping soot from her palms with a rag that had long since stopped being clean, and neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that it did not matter now what the town believed, for the work was done and it was good. The men began arriving with the sun, drawn by word that had traveled faster than the light itself, and among them came the rival, with his ledger and his certainty, and behind him the miners who had laughed at the well weeks before, and the boy who had repeated words he had not understood, all of them gathering at the yard's edge with the particular hunger of people who expected to witness a failure they had already decided upon. The rival lifted the first shoe himself, turning it in the early light, running a thumb along the curve of it, and his face, which had worn a smile riding in, lost that smile by degrees as he reached for a second, then a third, comparing them against a sample of his own stock that he had brought for the purpose of humiliation, and found instead served only to indict itself, for the iron he held was true where his own bent, sharp where his own dulled, each weld clean as a line, drawn with intention rather than haste. A murmur passed through the gathered men, not loud, not celebratory, but the low sound of people revising a judgment they had held as settled fact, and one of the miners, the same who had mocked him loudest at the well, took up a wagon fitting and turned it over twice before setting it down with something that was not quite an apology, but stood near enough to one. The rival opened his mouth as if to protest the evidence in his own hands, and found, for the first time since he had proposed the order, that he had nothing left to say, that the iron had not already answered, and the silence that followed was the truest verdict either of them could have hoped for, standing there together in the thin gold light, with the whole yard watching. The rival gathered his sample horseshoes with the stiff, unhurried motion of a man trying to preserve some scrap of composure, and when he found none of the men in the yard willing to meet his eye, he turned and walked toward the road without another word, his boots raising small clouds of dust that the morning wind carried off toward the tailings and the played-out claim that had brought him there in the first place. No one moved to stop him, and no one moved to console him either, for the yard had already rendered its judgment in the plainest language it knew, the language of iron held up to the light and found either true or wanting. The miners lingered a while longer, turning over fittings, asking after prices for spring work, speaking to her now in the ordinary tone men use with someone they have decided, without ceremony, to trust. And if any of them thought to apologize outright for the words spoken at the well, they did so instead by staying, by handing over coin, by nodding to him as they might nod to any smith whose work had earned the nod. When the yard had emptied, and the forge had gone quiet, save for the tick of cooling metal, she stood a long moment looking at the sign that hung crooked above the door, its paint sun-cracked and peeling around letters that named only a dead man's shop. She fetched a brush and a small tin of paint from the lean-to without announcing her purpose, and he watched her climb the short ladder and begin to letter beside the old name a new one, plain and unhurried, the strokes as careful as any weld he had ever laid. He did not ask her to explain it, for there was nothing in the act that required explaining. And when she came down and set the brush aside, she looked at the sign a moment as though satisfying herself that the balance of it was right. Two names, sharing a single board the way two people might share a single roof, a single labor, a single uncertain future, made steadier by being carried together. Then she crossed to where he stood at the anvil, its surface still faintly warm beneath her palm, and without speech, without the small formalities that might have made the moment easier to bear and harder to mean, she reached across the iron and took his remaining hand in hers, plain and certain as a nail driven true, and held it there while the morning light came up gold and steady over the yard, over the forge, over whatever it was they had decided, together, without needing to say the word for it, to build.